Creating a compelling studio portrait is not only very difficult, but it requires a lot of complex gear. You need things like lights, backdrops, modifiers, flags, props, reflectors, and a lot more, not to mention a space that's large enough to accommodate all of your setup and your vision. Once the raw image is captured, the job isn't done because the editing process will have either a small or a large effect on your final image. Now, have you ever wondered how much of what you see was created purely in camera with light, as opposed to in the editing room? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you some before and after images from my own studio work, and I will lift the veil on my own editing process and how much it influences the light of my original photos. Now, before we continue, I do want to emphasize that there is no substitute for learning lighting. As a portrait artist, I've spent countless hours studying with mentors, but also holding late-night portrait shoots at my studio to learn a new lighting technique or to refine one that I've already learned. And I say this to lay the groundwork for this video, and I want to dispel any misconceptions that great lighting can be created in Photoshop or that bad lighting can be fixed in Photoshop, because these are both completely false. Now, as AI technology grows exponentially, this actually might change, but at the timing of this video, you can't fix crap, for lack of a better word. In my studio, the amount and the kind of editing that I will apply to a photo is really tied to the purpose of the final image. So for instance, if I'm creating a head and shoulders headshot, I prefer a simple, clean lighting without a lot of editing applied. This is because those are usually for business clients or even for acting clients who need something that shows them, shows their expression, and just is a good representation of them. So I largely save the more dramatic look for my portrait work. So now let's get to the question at hand, and I can only answer, of course, for my own work. How much of the final product that you see is created in the editing room? So for me, it varies greatly depending on, like I just mentioned, the purpose, but also the capture, the subject, and the goal of the photo. There's really no one-size-fits-all approach, although I will say most of my portraits are color graded, and I do like a lot of shadow detail and intensity. So let's discuss some before and after images, and we will talk about the process that I use to create the final result. So first, let's look at this image of actor Lee. Now, this is typical of my portrait work. I chose to color grade this image because I wanted to move away from the warmer tones of the original. I tend to prefer cooler tones in my work, so if you look at a lot of my work, you're going to see a lot of it will be more towards the blues than it will be towards the reds and browns, although sometimes, depending on this context, I will do the opposite. Another common technique that I employ here, which I do in pretty much all my portrait work, is I'll create curves layers and I'll paint in the shadows and the highlights in order to emphasize that detail of the image. Something else I do is I'll darken the subject's hands just a bit so that they don't distract from the face. But if you look at the unedited image, you can see that the lighting is really the same. I didn't change the lighting. I may have emphasized it a bit with my editing process, but it is the same exact lighting. So I got what I wanted when I took the image with the lighting. And again, this is something I do quite often in my portrait work, so I'm not going to change anything about the lighting. The lighting is what it is. I'm just going to color grade it, and I'm going to add a couple of curves layers and a couple of levels layers to just bring out the dramatic nature of the image so that the final image is what I want it to be. And then a lot of times I'll employ a LUT or I'll create a LUT. All right, so let's move on to something that required a little bit more post-production. So once again, in this image, the lighting was created the old-fashioned way, in the studio using lights and flags. Now for this particular image, and something I do often, is I'll purposely slightly underexpose my original image. And I do this because it's a lot easier to bring up the shadows and retain detail than it is to bring down the highlights, because if you blow out the highlights, your detail is gone. If you slightly underexpose, especially if you're using a modern mirrorless camera, you have a lot of leeway to bring those shadows out and you'll still retain all of the detail. So in this particular image of Tariq, the most notable difference, as with the picture of Lee, is that I color graded it. So I created the color scheme in post. Now, another difference here is that the overall drama of the lighting has been enhanced to a greater degree than in the previous example. So I went a little heavier on the editing. Take a look at the shadows, camera left on his nose, for instance. The edit is quite a bit darker than the original. And the same can be said of the highlights on his camera right cheek. So I punched it up quite a bit. And there's a more distinct pop in the highlights than in the original. And this was accomplished not just by simply raising the exposure, but once again utilizing a number of curves layers and painting in shadows and highlights the way I like them. I also added some textured layers to aid in the color grading and to give the final image a grittier look. And just like the first image, the lighting itself, though, it hasn't been changed. I didn't create it in post. All of the lighting you see in the final image is exactly what it was when I created the image. In this next image of my son David, I used the same basic editing technique on the subject's face. So as with the last image of Tariq, I painted in the highlights and shadows, and I went heavy on this one too. I gave it almost like an HDR look. And as you can see, if you look at his cheek, it's considerably darker than the original. Although the shadows and the highlights basically are still what I created in camera with traditional lighting techniques. The background vignette, however, has been created completely in post, and I did this by making a new curves layer and painting the brightness in around David's head so that it gave the illusion of a light hitting the canvas behind him. And now this was my intent to do from the beginning with this particular image, because this is my son. He didn't really want to be doing this. And so I only had a few minutes to create the image with him, and I just got the one light that I used to create it situated. I said, all right, let's just take a quick picture. And in my mind, I was thinking, all right, I can create a vignette in post. I also increased the contrast quite a bit, and I crushed the darks and the lights using levels to give it a little bit extra pop. And this one actually was color graded as well, although I used a much more subtle grading, but you can see it still doesn't have the original color scheme. In the next image of my photographer friend, Catherine, besides all of the other techniques that I've already discussed, I also retouched her skin. Now, personally, I prefer the less is more approach when it comes to retouching, but almost every single image that leaves my studio is retouched to some degree or another. Sometimes that means removing a single blemish or a stray hair, but it depends on the person's skin and the context of the image. Now, I'm not going to rehash what I already have said, since this image was edited in much of the same way, but I will add here that I often will crop the image from a 4:6 to a 4:5 like I did in this one. I know I can set my camera to a 4:5 ratio, but I prefer the wider format for a couple of reasons. I like it because there's times where I feel like the 4:6 format really conveys the image properly, so I don't like getting rid of it. And it's also practical because I like to have a bit of wiggle room in my images for cropping, since I'm probably going to crop in anyway, like I did in this one. One other thing that I did in this particular image is I painted a bit of brightness into her eyes. And I do advise that if you're going to do this, you do it really, really gently, because it's easy to make the eyes start to look fake and phony and over sharpened. And that's a terrible look. You don't want to do that. So you got to be real subtle about it. All right, next let's look at this image of my photographer friend, John. Now, we created this image because we were exploring Dan Winter's style. So we spent a long time replicating the light of our inspiration image, and we used a bunch of different modifiers and flags before we got the light just right. Although I did my best to replicate the exact lighting in the camera, I did rely on editing to dial in some of the hard shadows, as well as to bring out the emphasis of the vignette. In the original image, I used a key light, a fill light, a flag, and a background light, and you can see it all in the unedited version. In post, however, I really greatly enhanced the hard shadow on the camera right side of his face, and I brightened the background light to add to the vignette the circular glow. The other thing that I did was I crushed the blacks, I popped the highlights, although I feel like the image is still kind of on the muted side. And then besides that, I adjusted the color to try and match the original image. So again, I used curves layers and adjusted each individual channel until I got it where I felt like it looked similar to my inspiration image. Now, in this image, the editing took on a much more integral role to the final image. But even so, I still did my best to remain faithful to the original lighting in camera without adding or creating something completely new that was not already present in the raw image I created. And I think this is super important for all of us to do, for learning purposes, for becoming better at what we do, for understanding light. Because if you don't understand light the way it hits a face as you're photographing people, you're not going to be able to take an image that, say, isn't perfectly lit, bring it into post, and then fix it. Because if you can't see how good light looks, you just can't see it. So again, I want to couch everything in this video by telling you that there's no shortcut for learning light the right way. All right, now I included the next image of ash because I want to show you that also very often there's little that you have to do in the editing room to create a final stellar image. So once again, I relied on lighting to create the original image in my studio. And in this particular image, I used a nan light in a 36-inch octa. The editing here was really simple. I applied curves layers to emphasize the shadows, and I adjusted the global levels, and I retouched her skin. That was it. So you could see here, there's a lot of drama still, but I didn't create any of it in post. It was basically there in the original image. And again, you just punch things up a little bit to get it to where you like it. All right, so this is a good kind of wide swath of how I edit when I'm doing my portraits. And the lightings I use are not overly complicated too. So one of my go-to lightings is 2 Westcott flex panels that I use for my portrait look, especially when I'm taking portraits at my posing table. And then I also use a nan light, a lot of times just with a bare reflector. So if you want to learn how to do these kinds of lighting techniques better, then I advise you to look up my friend Ivan Weiss, because he's the guy who taught me all of this. So Ivan is my portrait mentor. I'll link him below so you can check him out. And he does coachings and things like that. And he's one of my mentors through the Headshot crew. So check out the Headshot crew. Check out Ivan if you want to learn how to do the actual lighting. And he actually taught me pretty much all of the editing techniques too. Now, this last image I want to show you is not something that I do, and it's not something that I like as far as the editing. But I really just took this as an experiment to see how far I could go with editing. And so this is not at all representative of my style. And just for the record, I feel like it's way overdone. But I feel like there's also some context that you might want to look like this. And it's really interesting to see how much you can do with an image in post-production. So the original image was made with my Flex kit, and I used Peter Hurley's key fill kick method. But then I added multiple layers, multiple textures, curves layers, painted in all the darks and the shadows. I added a vignette. I punched up the contrast, and I did all this editing to really make the image something completely different. Now, as with the rest of the images in this video, I added a color grade as well. And again, this is way overdone in my opinion, but I could see a style like this working well for certain applications. For instance, if you're doing a movie poster for a movie about a dystopian future or a zombie apocalypse or a serial killer, you might want an image that's this overly like graded and gritty and almost a little bit disturbing. In general, I would never do this for a client, however, because it's also not very flattering. Now, I find that most of the photographers that I'm drawn to do not create all kinds of crazy lighting in post. They painstakingly create light the old-fashioned way in a studio with lights and modifiers and understanding light, understanding faces, and understanding that capturing the vision and the bulk of the vision in the raw image is key. So the post-production will certainly help to emphasize the final style, but it doesn't create it. And if you shoot tethered, it's also important to realize that if you're not showing your clients an accurate look at what the final images are going to be, they're going to have a hard time being on board with you. So if you're going to take an image and say to your client, oh, well, don't worry, because once I edit it, it'll this, it'll this, it'll this, it'll this. They're not going to be able to envision it. You're not going to have them on board, and it's also going to affect your bottom line. So I want my clients to look at the screen, see the images, and then have an idea of very clearly like, okay, this is almost exactly what the final image will look like, because then it helps to foster positive energy, and it helps to make the whole session go better. All right, everyone, well, that's all I have for you today. Now, I know this was a lot different than my typical videos. I'm not reviewing any gear today, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you got an inside look into what it's like to be a portrait photographer, at least what I do in my portrait studio. And if you are a portrait photographer, I hope you've been inspired to try some new things. Now, don't forget to visit my sponsors in the description below and all of my affiliate links. I appreciate it when you do that. That helps me to continue pouring a lot of energy and time into this channel, which I clearly love doing. Here's wishing you all an amazing day, my friends. Go out and take some great pictures, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.